Hi there. Today we're going to be looking at another module on the Elby Designs Swamp panel. Now this is the pulse divider and logic module, which you can find separately as the CGS36 or Cat Girl Synth 36 PCB. It sits right in the middle of the Swamp panel, and it provides a couple of really important functions that you need for a modular synth. Now, the nice thing about this is that the functions here are not specific to Serge at all. This same kind of thing you can find in Eurorack, you can find it in 5U, you can find it anywhere. So any know-how about this module can easily be used with other modulars. Okay, let's start with the divider. Now we put a signal here at the top into A, into this red one, and then all of these yellow outputs here output corresponding signals that are divisors of the signal that we put in here. So if we put a pulse into A, then we will get one out at A divided by 2 half as often. We will get one out at A divided by 3 a third as often, and so forth all the way down to A divided by 8. So let's take a look at what that sounds like. I'm going to take a pulse output of an LFO and I'm going to put it into A. Now let's take an output that we are going to permanently keep connected into A so that we can have something to refer against. So here we have a sound coming out of the Serge in which it's triggering every time that A gets a pulse in. We can speed it up, we can slow it down, but there it is. So we have this low frequency sound, we'll call it our kick drum, that's just humming along here. Now let's add another percussion sound that we can use to be able to compare against. So here is something that's a higher frequency sound, let's call it our snare, and we'll put it into the same place. So now we hear that both of them are constantly pulsing based on the frequency of the LFO that's coming into the divider. So what happens if instead we take this and we run it into one of these other voltage divisions? Well, A divided by 2 means that it'll output a pulse half as often as the pulse that's coming into A. A divided by 3, a third as often, A divided by 4, a fourth as often, and so on down to A divided by 8. So let's hear what that sounds like. Boom, 2, 1, 2. All right, now let's get some waltz time going. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now let's hear our snare happen a quarter as often as our kick drum. And now once every 5 beats. Once every 6. Once every 7th as often. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And finally, once every 8 beats. Okay. Well, that's all very nice, but that's not really all that scintillating. What can we do to get that to sound a little bit more interesting? And the answer lies in these logic modules here. So this divider is an analog output, and it's outputting pulses to all of these outputs at the same time. So what that means is that we can take more than one of these, mix them together, and using logic we can choose whether we want to have pulses come out every time either of them trigger, or every time both of them trigger at the same time. So that gets into this logic gate here. So we have two primary things that we're interested in. We have this one here that says A and B. So we have two inputs, input A and input B, and then we have this yellow output, A and B. And that output outputs a click or a pulse or a signal every time it receives a signal from both A and B at the same time. Now, if we move down here to the C or D, well, now this is an OR gate. In this case, we have the C input and the D input, and then we have the C or D output. And what happens here is any time that it receives a pulse from either C or D, which includes both of them at the same time, then it'll output a pulse there. So let's start with that. I'm going to take our same pulse input, and I'm going to put it into C or D. Now let's take a couple more cables. Let's start by putting one into A divided by 4. So I'll put that into either one, C. Now, let's plug everything back in. So this is just like it was before, where we had a pulse a quarter as often as the kick drum for the snare drum. So now let's make it interesting. Now let's add A divided by 3. And at this point, either time, either when A divided by 3 triggers or A divided by 4 triggers, or when both of them trigger, then we're going to get an output to the rhythm. And let's hear how that all of a sudden becomes more interesting. And of course, we can experiment with other subdivisions. Let's try A divided by 7. So we have this polyrhythmic phasing that's going on, which really makes the rhythm much more interesting than just the straight ahead stuff. Okay, now let's go away from OR for a minute and let's take a look at AND. So with AND, we're going to get a lot less frequent triggers, because what's going to happen with AND is that we have to have things that happen when both of the inputs are triggering at the same time. So let's try A divided by 4, and we'll never hear anything because there's no point where there's any inputs coming into B. Now, let's try A divided by 3 and put that into B. So the pulses are nowhere near as frequent as they were when we were in the OR, but we still are getting an interesting, rhythmic pattern happening here. So now, for fun, let's plug into A over 5 and A over 6 at the same time. And now, takes quite a while. Let's see what happens if we do A over 5 and A over 7. Okay. So that's a primary use of the pulse divider and the logic together. We have another input down here that we haven't talked about, which is NOT. Now what NOT does, NOT is an inverter, and so it takes whatever is coming in and it outputs the inverse of that. If we were to take the output of the A and plug it into E, then what would be coming out of E is everything that happens when we don't have an A and a B taking place. Now that's called a NAND gate, not AND. If we were to do the same thing with OR, then the output would be a NOR gate, N-O-R, not OR. Okay, now let's take a look at using audio with the voltage divider and the logic module. Now I know that I called this the pulse divider, and that's what it's called, but that's not strictly true. This is Serge. It's an analog system. We can put audio signals in, and we can see how these different things affect them as well. So let's listen to an oscillator that I have coming into A. Now, let's see what happens if I plug into the mixer a tap off of that from A divided by 2. All right, well now we are hearing two signals, one of which is half the frequency of the other. And as we go down, we can see that we're basically moving down the harmonic series. Everything is a divisor of the actual frequency of the sound that's coming into A. So that's a pretty cheap way to be able to get your oscillator melody to happen in some certain different kinds of harmonies. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, now we have a sequence going into that oscillator. Now let's see what happens if we mix in frequency-divided versions of that same thing. So A divided by 2 is an octave below A, which makes perfect sense. A divided by 3 is an octave and a fifth below. A divided by 4 is 2 octaves below A, and then it starts getting weird. That's pretty fun. And then finally, A divided by 8 is coming out 3 octaves below A. Okay, now let's see what happens if we try applying some audio signals to our logic modules here. Well, let's start with that same oscillator sound. Nothing very exciting. And let's take another oscillator and mix it in. Okay, just sounds like two frequencies that are both happening at the same time. Now, what would happen if instead we take that oscillator, our original oscillator, and we're putting it into the OR. And now let's take that second oscillator and put it in as the other input to the OR. Ooh. And now all of a sudden we get sideband modulation. Very interesting. Now let's see what happens if we do it with AND. A very different sound. And so we can use the pulse divider and the logic module both to be able to generate rhythms and to be able to generate interesting modulations of our sounds themselves. Well, that's it for this episode of Under the Big Tree. As always, if you like what we're doing around here, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And for now, this is Nick, signing off.